Well, thank you very much for the honor of inviting me to give this lecture tonight. I will start with a quote. Owing to past neglect in the face of the plainest warnings, we have entered upon a period of danger. The era of procrastination, of half measures, of soothing and baffling expediencies and delays is coming to a close. In its place, we are entering a period of consequences. That was Winston Churchill in 1936. To me, the most shocking news is the speed at which we are depleting our Earth. Developments we thought would take thousands of years, and we were told they would come in hundreds of years, then decades, and they now seem to rush towards us. Ivan McFadden has twice raced a yacht from Melbourne to Japan. The first time, about 10 years ago, he regularly saw turtles, dolphins, and flurries of feeding birds. But this time, for 3,000 nautical miles, there was nothing alive to be seen, he says. Would we have wanted previous generations to have treated our planetary home in this way? Our ancestors sometimes saw themselves living in historically important times of change and transition. This gave their own lives a sense of heightened importance, even if those who followed them did not share their perception. But today there can be no doubt that we live at a crucial time in human history. Our decisions and actions, or our failures to act, will have an impact on future generations for centuries, possibly for millennia, or even for geological time periods. This is an enormous responsibility which we cannot escape. It is the result of decisions taken first out of ignorance, but over the last decades knowingly, to bet the future of human civilization on the belief that economic growth, markets, and technologies will always find solutions to the problems they have created. In his overview of failed civilizations, Jared Diamond notes that the most frequent cause of their collapse was their holding on for too long to outdated belief systems which had once served them well, indeed provided the foundations for their success. Over the last century, Western Europe and North America developed a new belief system and political ideology, economic growth, which not surprisingly conquered the world as it promised paradise on earth for all. Warnings of natural limits were ridiculed and evaded until now by growing into the ecological and economic space of other countries, what we call globalization. To silence the skeptics and justify the wealth accumulation of a small global minority, economic growth has to constantly accelerate at the expense of our planet's health. Today, every living system is declining, and the rate of decline is accelerating. Important rules, like do not poison the water, a capital crime for our ancestors, or soil, or air, have been broken. Today, if you look at the science and are not pessimistic, you have not understood the data. But while the challenges we face today are unprecedented, history offers many examples of people overcoming seemingly impossible odds. Slavery abolitionists were the first to create an international movement to defend the rights of those they did not know. At that time, 3 out of 4 people in the world were enslaved. Enslaving each other was what human beings had done for ages. Abolitionists were ridiculed and told they would ruin the economy. But within a few decades, their moral crusade succeeded in delegitimizing slavery. In 1941, Winston Churchill told US President Roosevelt that he had no defense against the Nazi invasion and urgently needed planes and ships in huge numbers. Roosevelt called in the leaders of US industry, who said his demands were impossible. Roosevelt then enacted the Selective Service Act, allowing him to take over uncooperative factories, and the industrialists quickly changed course. By 1943, a plane was produced every 4 minutes, a tank every 7 minutes, and 2 sea-going ships every day. Roosevelt biographer Doris Kearns Goodwin writes, "Ironically, while the leaders of industry clung to a static view of the American economy, it was Roosevelt and his impractical theorists who held a powerful vision of the country's potential to produce more than anyone had ever dreamt possible." Visionary leaders expand the limits of possibility. But where are these leaders today, capable to inspire and motivate us to heed the increasingly desperate warnings of the scientific community by confronting the very inconvenient truth that current policies are leading not to a global paradise, but to the collapse of human civilization, possibly even of life on Earth? After the financial crash, the British Prime Minister at the time, Gordon Brown, wrote, "I believe the most stunning revelation of the crisis was this: the ethical values that matter in everyday life had never infused the financial market. Banks, he discovered, had spent savers' deposits without their knowledge. He was furious to discover this. We were misled," he writes. "Frankly, I was stunned to learn that the leader of a major G7 economy and long-time Chancellor of the Exchequer did not know how our financial system works." His chapter on China concludes that there is little doubt that measures must be taken to counteract China's lack of willingness to spend. That ever-increasing consumption is imperative worldwide is the basic belief system of our political leaders. When told that this is not physically possible, they are lost. But despite their repeated assurances that the global crisis is over, the percentage of US middle-class parents who believe their children will be better off fell from 71% in 2000 to 13% in 2013. In the USA, average vehicle miles traveled by 16 to 34-year-olds fell by 29% between 2001 and 2009. In Japan, the young Satori generation are increasingly anti-consumerist. This drives economists and politicians to despair, accusing them of destroying growth by refusing to consume. This growth, of course, is not human development, but GDP, which our leaders worship and do not dare to question. In the USA, under pressure from mining companies in 1995, Congress stopped the Bureau of Economic Analysis from working on reforming GDP and to take environmental costs into account. And 10 years ago, China suppressed green GDP data because they would show economic growth to have been far lower than previously claimed. Climate change is the defining issue of our time and the greatest challenge we will face wherever we live. A few weeks ago, I heard the director of Greenpeace International, Kuminaido, at a talk when he described a big conference where Shona Barrows, a high international trade union official, had been given a talk which was almost entirely focused on climate and the environment. And afterwards, somebody in the audience said, "I thought you would be speaking about jobs." And she looked at him and said, "There are no jobs on a dead planet." Climate change will create a huge refugee crisis for which we are neither politically nor morally prepared. In Bangladesh, 50,000 people already migrate to the capital every month because rising sea levels have made their villages uninhabitable and destroyed their arable land. The former head of the International Monetary Fund, Michel Camdessus, after an extended tour of Africa last year, now expects hundreds of millions of African climate refugees to try to reach Europe in the coming decades because they can no longer survive at home. Whatever methods the EU tries to use to stop them, enough will arrive to increasingly make European countries ungovernable. So how are our current leaders reacting to this growing emergency? We know that drastic decisions are now needed to have a fair chance of keeping global warming below the 2% limit, beyond which adaptation will not be possible. And I look forward very much to read the thesis, which was awarded, but I think we all know that there is a limit. You know, if you move above the 2%, the 2 degrees limit, then adaptation is no longer possible. It'll be hard enough even with plus 2 degrees. Plus 1.5 is the limit many think is the one which can adapt to, but above that it will not be possible. So is humanity pulling together to meet this global challenge? Is there any real sense of urgency beyond the rhetoric? So far, I'm afraid the answer is no. In the recent intergovernmental meetings in Bonn preparing for the Paris Climate Summit, the arguments were depressingly familiar. Indeed, you could look at these debates and wonder if they were held 10 or even 20 years ago. A few quotes from the discussions on financing, clearly a key issue. In the title of the first section, A Global Framework for Financing Sustainable Development, the G77 and China called for deleting sustainable. In a paragraph noting that governments and high representatives have gathered to address the challenge of financing sustainable development, the EU called for replacing financing with implementing. Canada, the EU, Japan, and the US did not support the G77 China proposal to call on developed countries to take the lead in addressing global risks. On ensuring significant mobilization of resources, the US said they could not support ensure and proposed promote. Australia cautioned against calling on investors to change or encourage certain behavior, stating that it may be interpreted as governments directing private actors. The G77 and China called for deleting the paragraph on gradually eliminating inefficient fuel fossil subsidies for production and consumption. Canada requested deleting the sentence on working towards putting a price on carbon. Australia, supported by the US, called for deleting the call for private actors to invest with the long-term horizons necessary for sustainable development and to shift to more sustainable consumption and production. Australia, supported by the US, expressed concern with the requirement that companies should incorporate non-financial factors into their reporting. In a paragraph indicating that member states will promote the development, dissemination, and diffusion of environmentally sound technologies to developing countries on favorable terms, the US objected to the reference to transfer on favorable terms, including on concessional and preferential terms anywhere in the document. The G77 and China proposed deleting text on including sustainable development provisions in both trade and investment agreements. The EU proposed text on assessing the human rights impact of the trade agreements. Australia and the US opposed. In case you think this is how political leaders always operate, this is a quote from President Roosevelt, 1936. I should like to have it said of my first administration that in it the forces of selfishness and of lust for power met their match. I should like to have it said of my second administration that in it these forces met their master. The depressing truth is that we were actually further 25 years ago. In the 1989 New York Times CBS poll, 80% in the USA agreed with a statement that, quote, protecting the environment is so important that standards cannot be too high and continuing environmental improvements must be made regardless of cost, end of quote. Today, the US Senate is chaired by a man who won election with the slogan, coal, guns, freedom. What happened in the meantime? The forces of selfishness and lust for power, referred to by Roosevelt, bought the world. Last year, Princeton University concluded that the USA no longer fulfills the criteria of a democracy, but those of an oligarchy. In the UK, while 3/4 of the population believe that the climate is changing because of human activity, only half of MPs do. 71% of Conservative MPs think that human-induced climate change is either unproven or environmentalist propaganda. But change can come very quickly when the time is ripe. In May 1989 in Moscow, the West German government representative assured his East German colleague that nobody in the West was thinking of changing the status of Berlin. The wall fell 6 months later. Suddenly the old order collapsed, and so-called ordinary people who had the trust of their fellow citizens found themselves brought together at the famous round tables to steer their country into the future. In the coming crisis, this could be your role. The president of China recently affirmed his belief that we must live in harmony with nature and unremittingly pursue self-renewal. He also declared his aim of building a moderately prosperous society, interesting terms, being well aware that the per capita resource consumption here in Europe cannot be replicated in China. It's just physically impossible. But this, of course, raises a question of its justification here. As economic growth cannot deliver West European living standards, material living standards for all without ruining the planet, issues of global justice and equity will have to be addressed. Serious leaders in the global south are well aware that duplicating the Western development model would destroy their environment, even if the CO2 emissions of the industrialized countries fell to zero. And as the late Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Meles Zenawi, said, equitable access to a train wreck is not a desirable goal. Neither is it equity or justice to foul the planet because others have done it in the past. It is claimed by apologists of the current growth model that poor countries care less about environmental threats, that it's some kind of luxury concern. But when a world public opinion poll asked for reactions to the statement that, quote, the struggle against climate change should be given priority, even if this would slow economic growth and cost jobs. In the USA, only 14% agreed unconditionally. In France, 23%. In Turkey, 37%. And in Kenya, 53%. However, we are told that consumers have the right to cheap flights, new runways, and gas-guzzling cars, even at the expense of their grandchildren. Presumably just like Roman consumers had the right to watch lions eating Christians. Perverted cost-benefit analysis make fossil fuels and nuclear cheaper than wind and solar because future generations are omitted from our economists' ideological calculations. The sooner we understand that this is not a science but a power game, the sooner we can build a just future. The fossil fuel lobbies, powered by over $500 billion in annual subsidies, will not easily be defeated. But the window of change is opening, and the choice is ours. Do we hide behind our careers and risk the angry questions of our children and grandchildren? Why did you not act when the climate war was still winnable? Or do we now dedicate ourselves to this unique historical challenge? I'm well aware of the risk of putting the choice so starkly. A friend of mine gave a talk on climate change in a Russian college some years after the fall of the Soviet Union. After convincing his audience that the environmental crisis was for real, several students stood up and left, one of them explaining that as capitalism was obviously also doomed, they were going to join the mafia and enjoy life while there was still time. The climate war will not be won by General Twitter or Admiral Facebook. Social media can mobilize, but the actual changes will require our live presence and commitment. As the PR guru Frank Mekiewicz once said, the environmentalists are going to have to be like the mob in that square in Romania who ended the Ceausescu dictatorship before they prevail. We need a radical and comprehensive transformation of our societies and ways of life if we don't want a future where disruption and conflict will be endemic features of life, to quote not some green activist, but a 2004 Pentagon report on environmental risks. How fast this future will come is the great unknown. 10,000 years ago, when the world came out of the last ice age, temperatures rose by more than 6 degrees in one decade. We're used to the media exaggerating news, but when it comes to climate news, the opposite is the case. Scientists are much more worried than commentators. When the Times recently presented a realistic overview of environmental threats, it was so concerned about reader reactions that it provided the phone number of the Samaritans. In poor countries, the climate chaos we read about is already there. impacting on every area of life as their knowledge of nature, which has enabled them to live, becomes increasingly invalid. The executive director of the International Energy Agency, Fatih Birol, who only recently understood the extent of the climate threat, now says that the next 2 years will be crucial if we are to stay within the plus 2 degrees centigrade average temperature increase, which is the maximum seen by most climatologists as having manageable consequences. Is there any chance of such a quick turnaround after the wasted decades and conferences until now? This largely depends on the pressure and energy from all of us. Recently, the Pope spoke out sternly and forcefully, and Catholics all over the world will need to act if they don't want to betray their faith. Last December in Stockholm, the Right Livelihood Award, widely known as the Alternative Nobel Prize, among others, went to Alan Rusbridger, then editor of The Guardian, now the world's largest online news site, and the prominent US climate campaigner Bill McKibben. Their meeting in Stockholm resulted in the ongoing Guardian campaign to make institutional investors withdraw their investments from fossil fuel companies. This has already forced the fossil fuel lobby on the defensive. It is a big issue, as 1/2 of the total value of the London Stock Exchange is invested in values which will become worthless if the underlying fossil fuel reserves are no longer exploitable due to climate threats and climate legislation. We're often told that there is no alternative to the present modern world order except returning to the Stone Age. That is, of course, nonsense. Even a generation ago, we could still have achieved a relatively smooth transition to a sustainable global order if we had listened to early warners like Al Gore and taken seriously the different future scenario options presented by the Club of Rome. As you may know, there were a number of options presented, only one leading to disaster, to crisis, the business as usual scenario, but that is the one which we have faithfully followed until now. Well, we didn't listen, and now the transition will therefore be much more challenging. But if we act now, a good quality of life for all is still achievable. The second report of the Club of Rome, less well known than Limits to Growth, was entitled No Limits to Learning. There are no limits to the number of skills and languages we can learn, musical instruments we can learn to play, etc. When Chandran Nair, chair of the Global Institute for Tomorrow in Hong Kong, who advises the Chinese government, was asked to give an example of what a sustainable global future would look like, he replied, fewer car races and more dancing competitions. This description of life in England during the Second World War points in the same direction. Quote, there was also a huge focus on enjoying low-consumption good times. There were campaigns to holiday at home and endless festivities such as dances, concerts, boxing displays, swimming galas, open-air theatre, all organized by local authorities with the express purpose of saving fuel by discouraging unnecessary travel. Over the course of the war, spending on relatively weightless entertainment went up as classical consumption went down. End of quote. Today, both the online world offers many new opportunities to enhance our quality of life while saving scarce natural resources. But it also consumes energy. A few years ago, a programmer told me that an avatar in the then popular program Second Life consumed as much energy as the average inhabitant of Costa Rica. In many ways, we don't know what a sustainable future would look like. As with the right policy incentives, a new era of innovation, of discovery and investment will present unimagined and exciting opportunities once we break free from our self-imposed limitations. The challenge we face is comparable to the end of the Middle Ages, when church power based on religious dogmas impeded progress. Just like the debates about these dogmas could only be held in Latin, in today's world ruled by money, debates are limited by financial dogmas and expected to be held within their parameters. Thus, every reform called for can be blocked by the claim that it would cost too much, suggesting that maybe we cannot afford to live on this planet. In reality, of course, whatever we can do, what we have the resources and the knowledge to do, we can also finance. Creating new money against new performance, i.e. for producing new goods and services, is not inflationary. If we could swiftly create trillions to save banks, we naturally can create whatever we need to stabilize the climate and protect our natural environment on which life on Earth, including economies and markets, depends. The consequences of financial debts can always be dealt with, but nature provides no rescue packages, and you cannot negotiate with a changing climate, with melting glaciers, or with spreading deserts. Today, the greatest single threat to our shared future are economists who do not understand natural limits and risk hierarchies, but whose advice is still taken seriously by our political leaders. They worship markets, but while markets are good servants, they are bad masters and an even worse religion. Their claim that markets can be self-regulating and are superior to the state is an ideological myth. As the sociologist of capitalism, Karl Polanyi, wrote, "The road to the free market was opened and kept open by an enormous increase in continuous, centrally organized and controlled interventionism." End of quote. Recent technological revolutions were often made possible by state support and regulation. When regulations are weakened by strong lobbies, costly crises are likely. In 2000 to 2002, governments were persuaded by the financial industry to make pure bets on future prices into legally enforceable contracts, no longer classified as gambling as they previously were. And this was a major cause of the financial crisis. Economists discounting the future discriminate by date of birth and make protecting future wealth uneconomic. It's interesting that Nicholas Stern has picked that up and is getting increasingly angry about this. Says, even the discounting rates which are normally used would mean that a life starting in 35 years from now be worth half as much as a life lived now. And he says, how can that be justified? Of course, this dogma, the discounting dogma, is based on the assumption that whatever happens, we will all be richer in the future. So you have one of these sort of climate, whatever one can call him, Björn Lomborg, who argues that we should wait before we really act, and he has this idea that economic growth will continue whatever happens. So yes, in 120 years' time, if climate change continues, Bangladesh will be underwater. But of course, if you extrapolate current economic growth rates in Bangladesh, by that time they'll be as rich as the Netherlands and can afford to build dikes and walls to protect themselves. So this is a kind of nonsense you have to deal with, because we are ruled by economists who have sort of lost connection, with the real world. Because if we are actually poorer in future due to environmental collapse, then of course resources will be more expensive and discount rates should be negative, which of course would totally transform our planning and priorities and economies. The famous economic bottom line completely depends on what we include in and exclude from the top line. Externalizing production costs is not only unfair competition, but fraud, and should be dealt with as such. As the English social critic John Ruskin wrote 150 years ago, "Private enterprise should never be interfered with, but on the contrary much encouraged, so long as it is indeed enterprise involving the exercise of individual ingenuity and audacity in new fields. But private enterprise that poisons its neighborhood or speculates for individual gain for common risk is very sharply to be interfered with." Today we have allowed the second kind of enterprise to become so powerful that forcing corporations to pay the full costs of their production would bankrupt most of them. The CEO of Puma, Jochen Seitz, calculated what it would cost if his company fully internalized all their production costs, and they found their profits would go down by 3/4. And I said to him, well, but you're very lucky, because with a high-value brand, the brand value by itself doesn't cause extra CO2 emissions. But most companies, of course, who don't have that privilege, same thing with tourism, 5-star tourism, if people pay £1,000 a night for some luxury resort, and you add another £150 a night to make it, have everything permaculture and do everything possible to offset the climate damage they have done to the climate, you can argue that that's sustainable. But of course, it's not a model for mass tourism where people can only afford £50 a night. So this is the problem with many of these models which are presented, that it is actually, our economics is based on fraud, because not paying the full cost of production, pretending that your product has at a certain price and it's, at a certain quality because you're a brilliant entrepreneur. In fact, it is because you're dumping part of the production costs onto the environment and future generations, is fraud and should be classified as such. The problem is that without detailed regulation, you can't actually change this. When Jochen Seitz looked at why these externalized costs were actually caused, he found only about 8% were caused within the company. The other 92% were caused in the longer supply chain. The main problem today is that, of course, we are not treated as citizens, we are only treated as consumers. We're told that the market has decided, but of course, our projects as consumers and citizens are and can be very different. There's a fascinating story from an American university where the Professor Mark Sagoff heard of an application by the Disney Corporation to build a Disney park inside a nearby American national park. So he asked his students if they would visit such a park if it was built, and the vast majority would. The consumer interest was clearly there. He then asked them the second question as citizens, not qualifying it like that, just asked the second question, which is rarely asked. Whether they thought would be right that the US government, whether the US government should allow such an application from Disney. And the overwhelming majority was strongly opposed, arguing that the government had a duty to future generations to preserve the national parks intact. But as I said, this second question is hardly ever asked. Advertising has built a culture of constant dissatisfaction and discontent, leaving Western adults on the emotional level of insecure teenagers. This has not been a natural development, but the result of a deliberate strategy as described by marketing pioneer Paul Mazur, quote, "We must shift America from a needs to a desire culture. People must be trained to desire to want new things, even before the old ones have been entirely consumed." As a result, Americans today buy twice as many items of clothing as they did only 20 years ago. The amount the average Briton spends on clothing almost doubled in 14 years, from 1990 to 2004, many decades after wartime scarcity ended. Our governments believe that the magic of the market will somehow produce the massive eco-industrial transformation which our global production systems now require. Oriana Guarini of the Risk Institute, one of the authors of the Club of Rome report, describes this faith in the power of price to dictate results as, quote, tantamount to a belief in myth or magic. To counter this myth, the World Future Council, which I founded in 2007, works to identify, spread, and adapt the most effective laws and policies from around the world, which can provide the incentives required to change course. And you will find some of our publications on the table at the door. For under the radar, such breakthrough policy solutions usually already exist somewhere, and policymakers elsewhere are keen to learn about them, but often do not have the information and capacity. The World Future Council was set up to assist them, to bridge the gap between policy research and the information policymakers actually require to change laws. There are many organizations today which focus on what to do and why and where we want to go. The World Future Council focuses on the how we actually get there, which is quite often the most challenging issue. There is a broad agreement that fossil fuel subsidies should be abolished from the right to left, but when you actually try to do it, you often face a revolution or major unrest unless you do it well. Sudan, Jordan, Nigeria failed. Indonesia managed after several tries to do it quite well in the last few years. This work is difficult. It's also difficult to fund. Martin Luther King once said that laws don't move the heart, but they restrain the heartless. Most of us want our hearts moved, including our funders. We work in many different areas as our resources allow, and we have brought together the most important breakthrough policies in our Global Policy Action Plan, GPACT, to overcome silos thinking and provide an integrated response to the interlinked global crisis. The plan combines tried and tested laws and policies that have been successful in one or more countries, as well as optimal policy solutions identified through our extensive research. Together they show the path to an ecological civilization. They can be found on www.futurepolicy.org. They include the following key areas where policy reforms are now vital. And as I said, wherever possible, they are based on existing policies. Legalizing debt-free money creation by central banks to fund the eco-industrial revolution. It's currently being debated in Iceland. Of course, you go back to the Chicago plan of the 1930s. There are a number of examples. We have just done a study on the various money reform proposals circulating, and sort of recommend one which is comparatively simple but which could have the effect we want. You will find that paper on our website. A green tax shift and green budgeting. Best proposal came from the Canadian Liberal Party in 2005. They didn't win that election, but it's there and ready to be implemented. Allowing only financial instruments that serve real wealth creation, a kind of roadworthiness test for financial instruments, and before you allow them, you should make sure they don't cause any harm. As I said before, this idea that bets on future prices, which are not underpinned in the real economy, i.e. not a farmer trying to hedge the price of his harvest, but just pure speculative bets, they were regarded as gambling until 2002, which meant contracts were not legally enforceable. And pressure from financial markets changed that law in a number of countries, and the result was immediately, of course, many of these products, so-called products, because they didn't produce anything, were then sold to local authorities in Germany, etc., who then lost huge amounts of money. Laws encouraging divestment from unethical investments, and the moral power of such divestments we know from the campaign against apartheid. And here the state pension fund guidelines in Norway provide a very good starting point. Mandating ecologically intelligent design and production. Again, the work on the cradle to cradle, CTC, provides a very good path ahead on that. Legalizing benefit corporations with broader social mandates. Very interesting, so-called Benefit Corporations Act introduced in the US state of Maryland in 2010, which is now spread to a number of other states. There are other countries where you can register them, but actually whether there is a law sort of behind them, the Maryland law is the best one we could identify. And then introducing environmental and peace education in school curricula. And interestingly, again, the US state of Maryland is in the forefront. Their Environmental Literacy Standards Act of 2011 we found to be the best we could identify. Ecological literacy testing in university economics courses and business school agendas, not yet legally mandated, but in the UK, the Exeter University One Planet MBA provides some very good indicators. Sustainable progress indicators for government decision making. We've all probably read about the Bhutan sort of global national happiness guidelines and gross national happiness product, which may not be replicable everywhere, but the EU has just recently conducted a study, which the World Future Council participated in, to look at why there are so many of these indicators, why they aren't implemented. This study goes under the name Brain Pool, if you want to look it up. Empowering women to ensure that every child born is wanted. We have a program working to end violence against women and girls, and this is one of the issues we are now looking into. We gave a policy award in this area last year, and for example, it's very interesting, you can have very similar laws in different countries, and in one law it works, and in one country it works, in other countries it doesn't, and quite often it depends on one individual. The laws against FGM, against genital cutting in Burkina Faso works because the president's wife took a personal interest, and in Burkina Faso actually, if a mother wants her daughter cut, she has to leave the country. It's too dangerous because she may be jailed if she does it in the country. There are a number of other countries with very similar laws, but without that personal commitment, they are not effective. Creating guardians for future generations on the national and international level. We have worked and got quite close, but we haven't quite succeeded yet in getting a UN High Commissioner for Future Generations appointed. but there is a very good law in Hungary and since a few months in Wales. Ending impunity for crimes against future generations. A number of interesting examples, one already in the Philippines in 1993, where the Supreme Court took action to protect the forests based on a law case which a father, a lawyer, Tony Oposa, introduced on behalf of his daughter. She is now in her 20s and a member of the World Future Council. Redirecting military spending to advance environmental, food and water security. A number of laws, especially on food security, perhaps interesting. A law in the Brazilian city of Belo Horizonte, which costs 2% of the city budget and has reduced child mortality by 60%, hunger by 75%. We are now working to take this law to Namibia, taking Namibian mayors to Belo Horizonte and vice versa to see how it can be adapted to their needs. Facilitating an inclusive transition to renewable energies and abolishing fossil fuel subsidies. I mentioned the Indonesian presidential decree abolishing fossil fuel subsidies on renewable energy, and our aim is 100% renewable energy. We have done a number of studies which show that that's possible. Of course, we have the feed-in tariffs, very effective, although there is now a sort of campaign against them in a number of countries, including the UK. Why is that? Why do they prefer trading? Because the financial industry can't make money on feed-in tariffs. That's why they prefer all these various trading schemes. But feed-in tariffs, of course, especially when you have locally owned, when they are promoted and owned locally, the solar and wind energy plants, like in Denmark, some parts of Germany, they are very, very effective and very popular. If they are owned by some foreign company, then you usually get local opposition. There are a number of other good laws. The Ontario, Canadian State of Ontario Green Energy Act of 2009 is one we also found very, very good. Securing biodiversity protection, the best law we found was the Costa Rican Biodiversity Law of 1998. Reversing deforestation and forest degradation, the Rwandan National Forestry Policy of 2004. Expanding and enforcing marine protected areas, the Palau Protected Areas Network of 2003. So for every problem, there usually is at least one good law somewhere which you can build on and adapt. In conclusion, the German philosopher Ernst Bloch once wrote that the price of human free will is the risk that the great historical moment will encounter too small a human race, one not up to the challenge. The old Israelites had the concept of chokhmah, the science of the heart, the ability to feel and act as if the future depends on each one of us. We now need to revive this inner force and free ourselves from the childish daydream of global consumerism built on permanent immaturity, dissatisfaction, and irresponsibility. We are now the most powerful generations in human history, the guardians of all future generations of life on Earth. The consequences of our decisions and actions will have longer-term effects than ever before. Each one of us has the power to decide if we're going to be part of the solution or part of the problem. To find our specific role, the advice of Aristotle still holds true. Where the needs of the world and your passion overlap, there lies your vocation. Thank you very much.